Good afternoon. My name is Fred Phelps, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. I have the honor today of welcoming you to the first of two webcasts on Indigenous perspectives in social work. It's a series that is a collaboration between the Manitoba College of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers in celebration of National Social Work Month. Today we have over 430 social workers registered for today's webinar, and we're honored to have Cara Moss, a registered social worker, therapist, trainer, and community volunteer to present to us today. In terms of process for the webinar today, the first half of the webcast, approximately 25 to 30 minutes, will be a presentation by Cara, followed by a half-hour question and answer period that I will moderate. During the presentation, I really urge you to type in any questions that you have, and those questions will be asked again after the presentation is done. After 25 or 30 minutes of her presentation, we'll get to the Q&A. So if you have a question during, please type it in, and we'll try to get to it during the question and answer period. Just also a note for those that will looking back to come back to this at some point, the recording of today's webinar as well as the PowerPoint will be linked shortly after the presentation to the CSW website. So now, without any further wait or ado, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Cara Moss to present to us today. And here you go. Take it away, Cara.
Hey, good morning. Thank you to everyone, including the Manitoba College of Social Work and consultants, for helping compile information and support for the webinar. We'll just begin by starting with an overview. The goal of the webinar is to promote discussion and encourage ongoing learning. I hope this brief webinar encourages Canadian social workers to learn more and contribute to the conversations. If you haven't yet done so, read Honoring the Truth and Reconciliation for the Future, the summary and the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. It's a good place to start. So today we'll be covering the following topics: contact and its consequences, 500 years of shared history, diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada, historical role of colonization, policies of assimilation and cultural genocide, why people are traumatized, ways in which trauma are expressed, and engagement. I'm going to briefly go over a bit of history in order to provide some context. Europeans began trading and settling in North America in the 1400s. The first permanent European settlement was in 1534, colony of New France. This colony, like the other settlements, was dependent upon the local Indigenous peoples for survival. At the time of contact, it is estimated that there were over 2 million Indigenous peoples living within thousands of different nations in now what is called Canada. Prior to the European contact, there was a vibrant, complex, and organized society in North America. Diversity. There are more than 600 First Nation communities, over 50 Inuit communities, and many Métis communities. Nearly 1.5 Canadians identify as being of Indigenous heritage, based on the 2011 census. Indigenous people are highly diverse. For example, some people live in remote Indigenous communities, while others live in urban settings. Indigenous people follow a variety of spiritual practices. This includes traditional, Christian, other faiths. Some Indigenous people do not identify with spiritual practices at all. In Manitoba, there are 63 Indigenous communities, 5 distinct languages spoken, which are Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene. It's important for us to remember the diversity of people and to ask questions in order to provide the best possible service. Now we're going to get into Canada's Aboriginal policies. We need to understand our history, helps us understand how we got to where we are now. In the next slides, we're going to learn more about the Indian Act and Canada's policy of cultural genocide. For over a century, the central goal of Canada's Aboriginal policies were to eliminate Aboriginal government, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. Colonization. Here I'm going to be talking about the 21 restrictions imposed at some point by the Indian Act in its 140 years of existence. The Indian Act denied women's status, introduced residential schools, created reserves, renamed individuals and European names, restricted First Nations from leaving reserves without permission from an Indian agent. A 2-week pass for Edward Yankenkook from the Saskatchewan Archive Board. This is one of the few remaining passes found in Canadian Archive, and it's proof of the pass system implemented in 1885. The policy controlled the movement of First Nation peoples off reserve. It enacted enfranchisement of any First Nations admitted to university. It could expropriate portions of reserve for roads, railways, and other public works, as well as move an entire reserve away from a municipality if it was deemed expedient. It could lease out uncultivated reserve lands to non-First Nations if the new leaseholder would use it for farming or pasture. It forbid First Nations from forming political organizations. It forbid anyone, First Nations or non-First Nations, from soliciting funds for First Nations legal claims without special license from the Superintendent General. It also forbid First Nations to pursue land claims, prohibited sales of alcohol to First Nations, prohibited sale of ammunition to First Nation, prohibited pool halls, and from allowing First Nation entrance. It imposed band council systems, forbid First Nations from speaking their native language, practicing their traditional religion. It also forbid First Nations from appearing in any public dance, show, exhibition, stampede, or pageant wearing traditional regalia. Declaring potlatch and other cultural ceremonies illegally denied First Nations right to vote, create permit system to control First Nations' ability to produce a farm created under the British rule for the purpose of subjugating one's race. Aboriginal peoples' major amendments were made to the Act in 1951 and in 1985. In the 1951 amendment, the banning of dances, ceremonies, and the pursuit of claims against the government were removed. In the 1985, Bill C-31 was introduced. For more information on this bill, please see the Indian Act and Women's Status Discrimination via Bill C-31 and Bill C-3. Other ways the Canadian government attempted to impose its policies include creation and maintenance of reserves, forced relocation of Indigenous communities to reserves, some located on marginal land in remote locations, the Indian agent, which we already spoke about, and banning cultural and spiritual practice, which we already mentioned. Colonization. We still live in the profound effect of this targeting of children. The Harper government apology may have been helpful for some. However, as Justice Murray Sinclair said, reconciliation is about forging and maintaining respectful relationships. There are no shortcuts. We're going to talk here a little bit about the 60 Scoop. Thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed with non-Indigenous foster or adoptive families. Social workers played an important role. As social workers, we need to be cognizant of the historical role that we play when working with people today. The impact of the 60 Scoop is still very present. Last month, the Ontario government ruled in favor of the group action law suit by Ontario 60 Scoop survivors. Although Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett said the government would not appeal, the government did not agree to the $1.3 million in damages. The impact of policy and cultural genocide. In the next few slides, we'll be discussing the experience of intergenerational trauma. Generation repeats breach of parent, child, and family attachment. Generation of loss of language, identity, self-esteem, belonging. Culture is made up of espoused beliefs, values, and assumptions that are held by society. However, how the individual perceives or practices their culture is also very individualistic and subjective. A person's culture helps determine their way of thinking, their ability to adapt to the world around them, and how they interact with others. Culture provides beliefs about the way things are. It helps us describe and understand reality in a particular way. Culture also provides guides to appropriate actions. It tells us the way that we ought to behave or act in a particular situation. This lends itself to be incongruent in challenging whether attachment theory is bound, and a lot of attachments broken due to colonization. As discussed earlier in other slides, prior to the European contact, the Indigenous nation of North America were complex, organized, self-governing nations. The loss of autonomy and self-government was therefore profound. A return to respect and dignity is part of the reconciliation process moving forward. Again, the impact of policy and cultural genocide include loss of land, home, economic means of supporting family and community, loss of government, loss of autonomy in adulthood, and denied the right to vote. Intergenerational trauma runs deep and it runs wide. During a traumatic event due to an outside force, the person feels helpless and powerless. In the case of Indigenous people and communities, it was set government policies that targeted whole generations. Most self-destructive behavior exists in order to attempt to cope with the pain from traumas. This compulsive coping can be normalized for individuals or communities. This can lead to the next generation experiencing the same pattern of suffering from the same problems. We need to always be mindful and understand social work's role in creating harm and trauma when working with Indigenous people. Humans manifest these types of intergenerational trauma in many ways, including remaining in the victim role, victimizing self, victimizing others, and the journey to healing. Lateral violence is internalized oppression and racism, shaming, humiliating, damaging, belittling, and sometimes violent behavior directed towards a member of a group by others of the same group. A learned behavior allows oppressed and vulnerable people to feel more powerful by turning their anger against each other. Even though these policies aren't in place right now, they affect colonies in other generations. The breakdown of Indigenous societies become an epidemic as people begin to internalize the oppression and racism. Habits and patterns can be repeated unconsciously. Some Indigenous peoples experience and or participate in lateral violence as part of this pattern. Symptoms of lateral violence can include gossip, put-down, competition, family feud, and gang wars. Too often we have an overrepresentation in systemic oppression. So why are Indigenous peoples overrepresented in so many negative statistics, such as jails, populations, children in care, suicide, addiction, health problems such as tuberculosis and diabetes? This is a big topic that warrants a lot more discussion. At the root is trauma and intergenerational trauma and social injustice. Many public policies have had a detrimental effect on Indigenous peoples. Attachments were broken and sometimes never reformed. Many of those children are now adults, and many have not had the opportunity to heal from their experience. The cycle of broken attachment continues, as these adults often struggle to form attachments to their children because they had never had a successful, secure attachment that was maintained from childhood to adulthood. Various attachment models are culturally appropriate, and research shows that attachment formation is not culturally bound by a specific culture, but it is formed in the same way, regardless of culture. So this brings us to reconciliation. What can Canadian social workers who are settlers, descendants of social workers do? There are many ways to effect positive change. We'll be touching on a few based on our code of ethics. This year, on Canada's 150th anniversary, we focus on taking action to create positive change. Again, a quote here states, "True reconciliation is to remember and change. Reconciliation acknowledges the truth of the past, recognizes our interdependence and our need for peaceful coexistence. We need to find ways to incorporate all six of our social work values in the reconciliation process. There are a few examples. Social work can pursue social justice in micro, meso, or macro ways. We can advocate for individual clients, for organizational change, or change in our country's policies and laws. We can break it down into 4 categories, which could include personal work, relational work, supportive work, and teaching. If we're to talk about personal work, this could consist of understanding who we are as social workers, where we come from, and how this impacts your decision and ways of practicing. Using the awareness to make conscious anti-oppressive choices, taking responsibility for our role in any oppressive process we've been involved with, finding social work employment that fits with our own personal values in order to ensure we are practicing social work values that we honor. An example of relational work could be things like being in relationship with Indigenous communities and people outside of the helping relationship, being around Indigenous communities and developing genuine relationships, forging friendships, and staying in dialogue with Indigenous people regarding our work. And supportive work, an example could be as simple as supporting the work of Indigenous nations, groups, and communities by attending a community action group that they're involved with. Teaching, we can ensure we invite Indigenous knowledge keepers to share Indigenous knowledge, teach people we work with to address structural change and colonial barriers and problems. It can also mean educating and being patient with our non-Indigenous colleagues to ensure we are being inclusive and to eliminate any lateral violence. We need to start finding ways. Being part of change starts with ourselves. Social workers need to learn about the people and communities they serve in order to provide the most competent service possible. By becoming knowledgeable, we are showing our respect for the people we serve. Reconciliation is respect for inherent dignity and worth of persons, respect the diversity among individuals in Canadian society and the right of individuals to their unique beliefs, consistent with the rights of others. Competent in professional practice, social workers strive to increase their professional knowledge and skill. In the next webinar, we're going to talk more about perhaps the 4 categories I mentioned of how we can focus on our own personal work, our relational work, supportive work, or teaching work. Hopefully, we can have discussions of other ways that we can work alongside with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples that we're serving. Next webinar, again, we're going to encourage ongoing discussions to learn about our shared history of colonization, to examine colonization from our social work lens, and to discuss where we are today as a consequence of colonization.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the question and answer segment of today. Again, thank you very much, Kara. I appreciate the historical overview of the oppression of Indigenous people in Canada, and I think it's very relevant. There was a budget yesterday of the federal government seeking to try to forge a differing path, a nation-to-nation path with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I think with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and a couple of years ago, and everyone looking forward to how we can better support and how we can change the relationship with the First People of Canada, I think is very timely to have this discussion today. For those that are on the line, if you do have your questions, I urge right now for you to type them in. And there are a few notes here where people are asking, will the notes be available or the PowerPoint be available? Yes, the recording of this webinar will be made available on the CSW website as well as the PowerPoint itself. So without further, I think we'll go into a few questions. I think the first one here is sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the amount of trauma that my clients who are Indigenous are facing. how can I be helpful?
Again, I touched on that a little bit. I would like, think about where you believe you'll have the most impact, what kind of work you're doing, if that's, again, micro, meso, how can you have the best impact with the people you're working with? What kind of social work do you practice? What are your skills? Would you have the most impact advocating for individual client who is Indigenous, or maybe you would have the most impact developing or improving policies in your large organization? You might have the most impact either, again, on, it depends where you're working and who you're working with. And I would just say also just to walk alongside the client that are facing so much traumatic. You know, sometimes it does feel overwhelming.
That's good. That leads into the next question here is how can I incorporate Indigenous values into my practice?
It's always helpful to start with ourselves. It helps to strive to be aware of ourselves as much as possible. Making understanding our shared history a priority is a good start. Ask as much questions of the person we're working with as possible. I would encourage, again, to read the Truth and Reconciliation Report if you haven't done so, because that is a really good overview. A thorough increasing understanding and knowledge, social workers' competence level increases, whether their work with individual clients who are Indigenous or their work in developing policies or services that impact Indigenous peoples. People don't want to feel judged, so always include the client who are Indigenous. If we're serving Indigenous clients, it's important to strive to be a safe person and to approach our practice with humility and understanding. Again, we'll be talking more about this in our next webinar. So,
excellent. Thank you very much. There are a number of questions coming in, so I'm just going to move on to this one. And I think it's very, very clear. It's what does reconciliation mean to you?
Well, I always like the quote from Justice Murray Sinclair. It said, so while reconciliation is about forging and maintaining respectful relationships, there are no shortcuts. I also believe it requires a great deal of personal transformation on intellectual and a spiritual and emotional basis. So again, it would start with us, and we need to be cognizant of where we're sitting and how we can best serve the person that we're trying to work with.
Excellent. Here's a question too here. Do you have a recommendation of good cultural safety training for staff? It may be some of these questions might be able to take in and apply to a next webinar and bring some resources too. I know often these are kind of not out of the blue, but may not reflect fully the presentation. But if you have any recommendations of cultural safety training for staff, that's the question that was put out.
Well, I don't know. I can't think of a training specifically right now, but I would say when we're trying to work on cultural safety, we'd like to find the elder in our community and try and be as inclusive as possible and try and flush out some hard questions prior to going into the training so we can have people aren't feeling on the spot. Perhaps they're experiencing lateral violence, they don't want to talk about it. So I would have some of these staged prior to and just include them in the presentation.
You referred in your presentation to lateral violence, and I think the next question here is, I think for yourself, have you experienced lateral violence, and what did you do about it?
Yes, unfortunately, I have experienced lateral violence. It is quite hurtful, but I also found it really helpful to debrief with colleagues, and we can acknowledge that lateral violence is hurtful and it's also at the roots of experiencing oppression. Again, what I found was experiencing this myself when I began talking with people. I wasn't the only one who was experiencing it, and then there was some dialogue with colleagues and stuff like that. But because I have experience, I make a point of being very cognizant of it and trying to bring it into wherever I'm working or with the people I'm working with and trying to practice and promote lateral empathy. That's where we're practicing lateral empathy. We are acting in a positive and helpful way in our community, being of a support and service to those who need it. So again, just having dialogue about it, because the more I talk about it, the more I'm finding even people, maybe they're just hearing this go on and they're realizing that even though they're just listening to people put down other people or, say derogatory things to their colleagues or whatever who are of the same race, they're realizing that just by listening to it, what can they do to intervene and to try and create more knowledge around it. So
Perfect.
again, I think it starts.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for your courage to present for us today. I think it's knowledge that we very much need and need the context and need the knowledge transferred and passed down. This question, I think, is fairly similar to one just asked, but it may give you some opportunity to expand on your answer. Is there a way to support an individual Indigenous person with their trauma if they do not believe the negative experiences of their group of Indigenous persons affects them, even if you have a feeling it may? I think it probably is referring to the internalized oppression that you spoke about in your presentation, and if someone's not seeing it with themselves or doesn't feel that the negative experiences are affecting them.
Oh, sure. I work in various different communities up north, and I do a lot of private practice with therapy. And actually, I do. It's an organic way. It kind of happens when you're sitting with somebody. Sometimes we just start to have dialogue, and I'll just start talking about the various ways that colonization has occurred, perhaps in their community, because I work with some communities that have been displaced themselves. So when I bring that up, they start to really explore and have conversations about perhaps it did affect them in a negative way more than they thought, and then they're able to talk about situations and scenarios. So then I would help them put that into a positive framework, or in a framework that acknowledges their hurt or their unresolved trauma, that they're not really describing as trauma. So then we just kind of go from there, and we do it in a safe manner. And again, you judge that when you're working with clients of how far you can explore this with them without causing further damage. So we need to be very cognizant of what our role is in not recreating or re-traumatizing somebody when talking about trauma and intergenerational trauma.
I think that leads very much well into this next question. Are there any practice techniques or tools that best fit with the pursuit of reconciliation?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, no worries. And I know it's very difficult for the audience because it comes. Some of the questions come from not way out there, but you might not have the tools and such in front of a person. So we will also take notes for next webinar so that some of these things we might be able to fill in. But are there any practice techniques or tools that best fit with the pursuit of reconciliation?
I would say relationships have a pattern of energy, and the energy flows through sharing experiences and storytelling and narrative. The narrative approach works well. And it depends with I work with a lot of elders in communities who have been actually there when the displacement was happening, or they're older, like in their 80s or so they've experienced a lot of this firsthand, and they enjoy just the narrative approach and being able to tell their story. And what the feedback is when we take that approach is they just enjoy being heard and listened. They say they know they can't change some stuff, but just perhaps a narrative along with some other storytelling. And the other thing, another type of therapy is acceptance therapy. So to work on all that, just depending on where the client's at.
Patterns of energy. I really like that. I'd like to play a little bit more off of that, and hopefully we'll find a question in here as we go along. Next one I think might be more of a comment, but I think it's worthy of bringing out is as a social worker, it's often very challenging to present present change to honor reconciliation when officials, in brackets government included, continue to represent the values of genocide of the Indigenous culture. Many family service systems follow prejudice systems. I think it's more of a statement, but I think it leads into the next question, which would be, what can we do to help Indigenous communities that are at very high risk?
Well, there's been increasing media attention about Cree Lake, the suicides, Shamattawa First Nations. These communities are trying to cope with the devastation of lack of resources and infrastructure. So perhaps we can support by assisting the communities to build resources that they identify as needed. We can also be supported by assisting with training of community members to develop capacity that they've identified as a need. So training for the natural leaders of the community, help build their capacity so they can help build the younger generation, and also have forums with the youth and ask them what they'd like to see happen in their community.
Okay. This question, again, might be one that we might want to take note of for the next webinar when we're discussing the consequences of colonization. And it says, I'm an evaluator for a social service agency. Is there a best practice tool or document on how to collect data and or do research that is inclusive of Indigenous people?
Well, that's actually very interesting. I was at a seminar recently, and there was talk about how social workers sometimes collect their data and how sometimes we need to be very cognizant of how we write about the clients that we're working with, because sometimes our language can be, again, oppressive. And if we're documenting about clients and stuff like that, we want to be sure to be doing it in a positive light rather than re-colonizing and putting negative spin on stuff. And unfortunately, sometimes at government, we need to, sometimes the way things are structured, again, need to sometimes frame things in a certain way, but as social workers, we need to make sure we're always trying to be uplifting and respectful of the people we're serving. So a lot of it is in language and what language we're using. I'm not sure if that's answering the question or...
Yeah, I think it is to a certain extent, and I think we'll take note of these. And I think as we move into the next webinar, maybe looking at if there are specific tools. But it is very difficult because specific tools might work in certain circumstances, but with one population, but not necessarily with a different population. And I think that moves into this next question, because I think there are so many different nations of First Nations across Canada, and this one question here kind of lends itself to understanding reconciliation a little better and having open and honest conversation. And so her question is, the term Aboriginal was changed to Indigenous. Was this done as a reflection towards moving forward in reconciliation? And I think the term and the use of differing names to refer to Indigenous populations, I think that's kind of the crutch of her question.
Of how we refer to, and again, I would think, like you said, it talks about there's so many different nations and how people like to identify themselves, to self-identify, and language is always evolving. So it's always good to keep that in mind. And again, it's about how someone wants to self-identify.
So you're saying really when you're working with it could be an Indigenous population in British Columbia or in Ontario, really how people self-identify? Yeah. Is how you would say people's best practice in the sense of working with that population?
Yeah. Again, that's we want to start out where the person's at and follow their lead, because we're not the experts as social workers. I believe the clients are. So we need to disrupt the idea that social workers are the expert, and let's remember the client's expert in their own lives. So we need to increase the understanding of our own privilege. Perhaps even if we are Indigenous social workers, we still have sometimes privilege because we have a degree or working in different. We have, power comes into play there. So that possibly could be a topic in our next webinar, is about how power and just being an Indigenous social worker, being what kind of power each person holds.
I think that's a really good question good answer leading into the next question someone has about privilege, and basically how do you suggest I reduce the harm in the helping relationship? And I think they're alluding to the understanding of privilege.
Right. So we'd want to work alongside the person, or help advocate for whatever. If we're working for an organization, we'd help advocate and find out what their goals are and what their mission is and how to best get that. And we'd like to talk with the client, whether that's an organization or whether that's on an individual level. So it's kind of broad, the question. But we want to support decolonization and restructuring process of anyone that we're working with, whether that's young people organization, or like I said, depending on what form you're working, micro, meso, or macro.
Yeah, I think this question is along the same lines, so I might give you an opportunity to expand a bit more on the previous answers. As a non-Indigenous social worker, other than being aware of privilege and power, how do I support Indigenous people one-on-one, and what role ought I play?
I would, well, like again, I would, if I was non-Indigenous, I would talk about our own privilege with the client, and I would also ask them, how they feel about me being non-Indigenous. Just talk about that and try and align yourself with the client so they know that they are expert in their own lives, and clear it, like get it out of the way first thing, so that sometimes I have, you may think I have privilege, or just talk about like the elephant in the room, what could not be said, so they feel like you're aware of that. Perhaps you have more privilege because if you're non-Indigenous.
This one takes it in a little different direction, and I'm glad you're on the hot seat today and not me, Kara. I know it's difficult moving from one subject to the other and organizing your thoughts that way, so I very much appreciate it, and I know the audience appreciates it as well. How do you suggest bringing more information about reconciliation to systems that are systematically oppressive, such as the justice system?
Like if I was working within the justice system, how I would begin to...
I think it's probably looking within and probably outside. The way that it's worded, it appears to me that it would be an individual looking at if the justice system is systematically oppressive, how can I work to have it be less oppressive?
I would start out with engaging with self-examination and dialogue with ourselves, like everything starts with ourselves, and to be more aware, bring more awareness to the organization and those working within the organization, and training for people who are working in those systems. And I believe it all starts with just having like gentle conversations with people who you think might not be acknowledging or believing that they're working in an oppressive system. Sometimes talking about the issue at hand, like whether it's you start out as a bigger conversation talking about the colonization that happened in the country, and bringing it down to how are we being affected, how are we contributing to this while we're working in the justice system. Just asking a question to a large group of people to have a brainstorm, so it's non-threatening.
This one again is coming at it different, but I think it fits into what you would a question you'd like, and that's what are your thoughts on educating Indigenous youth about our shared history when they're in the midst of dealing with their developmental trauma and engaging in high-risk behaviors that may not have an awareness may not have an awareness of their cultural history. I'll say that again because I think it's a very poignant question. What are your thoughts on educating Indigenous youth about our shared history when they are in the midst of dealing with their developmental trauma and engaging in high-risk behaviors and may not have an awareness of their cultural history?
Well, I think it's important too, and I know the education systems are introducing, so that's a big question, because the education systems are implementing education of the history of Canada and the oppression and the colonization that's happened. But the second part of the question talks about something about, it's a little more delicate, because if we're talking about, you're saying youth who are experiencing intergenerational trauma, they might not know they're experiencing it again. So it would be like the same question that was asked previously, that we would go into teaching people of how to address, or maybe how just educate them that this perhaps happened and perhaps they were part of it, or and provide the opportunity to be around ceremony and culture, and just introduce some stuff that they maybe haven't been aware of before. I'd be careful if they're experiencing trauma and stuff like that. So that's a whole different level of the question. So that's why
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm answering the question
Very
properly.
good point. And I think this will be a difficult one for you to answer because it's hard to speak for the profession, but how is the profession working with the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations? So I think it'd be kind of difficult for you to answer. You can have your take, and it may be something I might be able to address as well a bit.
Maybe you could address that for now, and then we can write that question down, and we can have more of that in the presentation for next time. But like I said, I think we're inviting the whole profession as a whole to participate in webinars like this, so we can all get together and have ideas going forward, because that is the big question that we started to talk about in this webinar, was how we're going to have ongoing discussions and examine how we're going to have work together towards a healing with people we're serving as a profession as a whole, because social work, as it was mentioned in here briefly, is that in different various forms of it, like you talked about the social justice, perhaps child welfare, those are mandated services that unfortunately there is oppression, or there is some stuff going on there that people that work in those systems need to be aware of, so we're not doing the damage. So it is a very big question.
Yeah, thanks. And I think
we're having
sorry, I didn't realize you weren't finished. My apologies.
No, I was just saying that's why we're trying to have conversations like this as a profession as a whole. So.
Yeah, I think you're correct. The Truth and Reconciliation and the recommendations in that report are very powerful, and I think each province and territory and on the national level, having a reflection on how you can move forward in reconciliation is something that an ongoing dialogue on that, and moving not to replicate and to provide opportunities like this where there are a lot of social workers that never went through in their classes, in their schooling, never took on any aspect of the oppression of Indigenous populations, and it's becoming core to some of the education across Canada. And as we develop and become it more core to the survey in education and in ongoing education, is something like we're doing today. Hopefully, we begin to reduce and not replicate the trauma from generation to generation. The next question I have here, actually there's a few people that have checked in again asking about the recording of the webinar, and yes, the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint will be downloaded, will be on our website, and it says link to the TRC recommendations. They'd like that in the same place as well, and I think we can actually upload a link to the TRC recommendations as well. So we'll do all of that in the sense after this presentation is complete. And just as a housekeeping note for those on the call, if you're here for 45 minutes or more on the call, at the end of the presentation, there's a yellow icon at the rightmost bottom of your presentation window. You should be able to click that and get a certificate of attendance for today. If it isn't available immediately, you can come back in and log in a few hours later, and it should be made available for you there. So the next question on what can social workers do to reduce or eliminate the income gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples? That's a big question.
The income gap?
Yeah.
That is a big question.
That one's I think a little difficult to answer. Quite certain I can move on to the next if it's not within the purview of this webinar. I don't want to answer for you because it's certainly not my place to do so. I will, let's see. There's a few people asking and saying, they're really, this is really complex and important understanding for social work, and I really appreciate the presenters' attention and knowledge in addressing some of these issues. And someone's asking, in response to income gap would be a social enterprise. So it's good to see that we have an engaged group of social workers that are providing answers when we're not quick to answer the question itself. Many of my clients are receiving traditional healing in their community at the same time they are seeing me. Please comment on the blending of traditional healing and social work practice methods.
I think that's really really good for them doing that, and often that's a compliment to them seeing you as well as seeing the traditional whatever kind of healing they're getting, the grassroots healing they're getting, or perhaps from the elder. I'm not sure what it is, but if they're still continuing to see you as well as both, they're obviously getting benefit, and it's a compliment. So any kind of help they're reaching out for, again, they're motivated to some healing, so they're getting something from it.
Excellent. This might be, again, for the next presentation, just a side note to gather information, but you may have it already. I would like to, I like your comment about oppression in mandated services, such as child protection and probation. Any resources available to begin the conversation about policy changes?
What was the question? About policy
question
changes?
Is that the individual liked your comment about oppression in mandated services such as child protection and probation, looking at any services, are there any resources available to begin the conversation about policy changes? So again, someone looking for some resources, maybe I think on the looking to trying to change the macro and the system change.
That's something we can prepare for the next time for sure, to have a more in-depth answer, because it's a very good question. So, and it would depend on, where you're working, right? So how would you best, I don't really know if I can answer that, because I don't know if they're working with individuals.
Oh, that's fair enough. It's there's a lot of questions coming at you and a lot of resources being requested, and you can't prepare for everything in this one, and it's just good that we can note and hopefully incorporate some in our second webinar that we'll be running April 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the next question is, what is the most important thing for a settler social worker to remember or keep in mind in their practice working with an Indigenous client? I think we've kind of covered this, but it might give you an opportunity to throw in some more.
I would just say respect, that, acknowledge that they are the expert in their own culture, and, I would say be curious and ask a lot of questions so they can share what they know and have reciprocity and talk about perhaps what they're looking for. Is be prepared to learn from the client.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a few comments in here, so I think I'll bring forward the comments. I've been focusing on questions, but I'll bring out some of the comments, and it's just, I think, individuals' perspectives and just wanting the group know we lose our Métis status when moving from province to province. Province to province, sad that geography erases our heritage, which is a very, very good point. This is a really complex, important understanding for social work, and I really appreciate the presenter's attention and knowledge in addressing some of the issues. Here's a question I think that one of the final questions we'll ask for today, and there continues to be an overrepresentation of Indigenous children growing up in government care. How might we as social workers work together with Indigenous communities to change the statistic?
I would say we try to develop some resources in the community, like to build capacity, such as food banks, develop healthy networks like volunteering, help, like we talked about, advocating, helping the community leader, of their already natural leader in the community, to help them to be able to advocate for more supports, like such as housing, family resources, just to develop resources within the community, and to help them not feel so alone, to help them advocate with different government officials and stuff like that, I would say.
Okay, perfect. And I'll only fire, I think, one or two more questions at you, and then we'll wrap it up for today. And again, thank you very much for your time. When people's knowledge about the world around them is discredited, they're incapable of understanding the outside forces that shape them. As a frontline worker, are there approaches, and what is yours?
Other approaches for?
I think it's the individual looking at approaches, I think, for you, for individuals that may be in the community that don't recognize, don't understand, or refuse to accept the Indigenous experience and your experience, especially when it comes to lateral violence. So I think those that maybe don't necessarily see a problem with the residential schools, or with the intergenerational trauma of residential schools to the 60s scoop, and some would argue a continuation with the imagined number of Indigenous children in care at this point in history. So for those that aren't understanding and actually seek to discredit history, how within your practice, I think, do you consciousness raise with those individuals that may be your clients that are refusing to accept history or your trauma itself?
Yeah, and I guess you just touched on the word I was thinking of as consciousness raising, to structurally show clients they are not to blame for what has happened to them, that it's not their so, again, not blaming the victim, and just trying to help them get through that. And maybe, those people that aren't going to understand, help them, because that's another teaching moment to help a client, is that not everyone's going to agree with them, not everyone's going to like them, right? And we still have to go on and build that capacity, help them build that capacity that some people aren't going to like us. Some people aren't going to like what I have to say on this webinar, but, I can go ahead and manage my life, right? Where those are the kind of things that we're trying to develop in therapeutic relationships, that we're okay on our own, and, just to have that self-efficacy, help them develop that.
Okay. Now, this will be the last question of today, and I think you'll have some good answer for it. Do you have any suggestions for social workers working with a number of family members dealing with intergenerational trauma? And I think you've alluded to doing some of your work in the North in differing communities, and I think if you can share some of your knowledge and your experience in this regard, it would be appreciated.
There's various things you can do. You can just do family group conferencing. You can do, depending on the family and how what they're open to. If they have experienced that intergenerational trauma, I guess starting with, not thinking that they're to blame, that this happened and this is why. Maybe a lot of times when I talk about attachment with clients, they didn't realize that, attachment was part of it, and then they start seeing how it's impacting them and their children going forward. So they look at their own upbringing, and when they're able to make the connections, it helps them go forward, and they have something to go on. So whatever is going to help the client engage and understand. If something doesn't work, then you try a different approach. So a lot of times it depends on the situation. If someone's having struggles with, parenting, or wondering why they're disconnected, I would do attachment. Or if someone's talking about addictions, we talk about various, coping mechanisms, that maybe it's a response, because substance abuse is sometimes a traumatic response to things that have happened to them. And it's, again, that in that one slide, it talks about all the different things that are overrepresentation. Addictions is one of them. So it depends on what the client's struggling with.
Well, again, I thank you, Cara, today for the courage to take on this subject, consciousness raised to support the dialogue moving forward. I think it is Indigenous perspectives in social work. We need to be grounded in this as we move forward as a profession, both as individuals and at the structural level, advocating on the national level. And I thank you for taking the time today and prepping for this. And I know it is very difficult doing the Q&A section where questions are coming from very, very differing perspectives. I'm very much looking forward to the next webinar when you encourage the ongoing discussion, learning about the shared history of colonization, and discuss the consequences of colonization. And I think we'll take some of the learning from this webinar, maybe some of the questions, and maybe provide whether it be a resource sheet or something along those lines. I don't want to preempt your development of the next one, but I think this webinar will certainly inform, and hopefully if we didn't get to your question today, that we might be able to get to your question in the next webinar. Again, this webinar was presented by the Manitoba College of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers in celebration of National Social Work Month. Again, Kara, thank you for your time. Our next webinar is April 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern. If you have not yet signed up, please do so. And there is a short survey that on our website if you want to provide feedback, and you can in that provide maybe some direction or suggestions for the future of webinars, especially webinars that you may want from the Indigenous perspective in social work. So again, thank you very much. And finally, the PowerPoint itself, again, just for those that may be tapping in late, the PowerPoint, the presentation, the recording of the presentation, and the link to the TRC recommendations will be on the CSW website under continuing education shortly after this. And again, if you were on this more than 45 minutes, at the bottom right of your screen is a yellow icon. Click that and you should be able to download the certificate of attendance for your continuing education credits. And if not, log back in a few hours and it should be there for you. Thank you, Kara, and until next time, everyone have a great rest of your National Social Work Month. Take care.